I'm Cynthia Leach, Senior Director, Economic Thought Leadership, RBC Economics.
Cynthia, first of all, thank you for doing this interview. Very excited to talk with you today. Let's start with a very broad question. What would you say are the main forces that are impacting Canada's exports and broader trade relationships, and what are their implications for Canada's future economy?
Well, before we get into the specifics, maybe it's worth mentioning why RBC Economics wrote a report about trade and why we did it now. We recognize that precisely because there are these forces reshaping global trade, and precisely because it's going to reshape opportunities for Canada going forward, that we need to take stock and decide where Canada fits in this new global trade order, and that, with the right strategies, we could position Canada's export sectors for growth and to fuel the economic recovery. So, there are several forces reshaping global trade, manifested mostly in the rhetoric around reshoring. So the bringing back or repatriation of lost manufacturing capacity that was sent offshore, over the last couple decades. Many countries are talking about reshoring, and it's taking the sense of a strategic reshoring in many cases, focusing on priority areas for national interests and establishing dominance in new or growing supply chains. So some of the drivers of these or imperatives that are dictating these areas, of course, are public health supplies, what we see in PPEs and vaccines, also concerns over national security, geopolitical positioning that we see increasingly with the US and China, as well as, areas for jobs and that will fuel the recovery. And so it leads back to growing areas that have been propelled forward by the pandemic, digital technologies and green technologies that are increasingly going to be defining areas of growth and value in economies in the decades to come.
Yeah, I hear you. So there's a lot to tackle here, and I'd like to focus a little bit more on the specific results of RBC Economics' latest report, Trading Places, which clearly exposes challenges in Canada's global trade strategy. Could you speak specifically about the problems that exist in Canada, basically, and why it is important for us to address them right now?
Absolutely. We didn't get into all the specifics about the why. We looked at the outcomes and made, to make the point that Canada approaches this shifting trade landscape with challenge export competitiveness. Our exports have not been a significant source of economic growth for years. For the last 2 decades, it's lagged economic growth compared to the period prior. And what that means is Canada is overly exposed to, shocks in the housing or the consumption sphere where our growth is concentrated. Also, we have a lot of free trade agreements, but Canada continues to rely on the US as a chief export market. And, it represents the destination of 70+% of our exports, just like the prior 3 decades. And yet in this very market, we've been losing market share, not just to low-cost labor locales like China and Mexico for high labor input goods, but also to those very same places for some increasingly complex products. And overall, we are not a major exporter to the US of advanced technology products. Areas that you might think would be a comparative advantage for a country like Canada with a high skilled labor force and other aspects of a knowledge economy. And, these forces that are shifting global trade are also going to be impacting our traditional export basket. Over 50% of our exports to the US, or about $230 billion annually, is concentrated in 3 buckets. So energy, autos and parts, and metals and minerals. And increasing digitization, increasing green economy, and reshoring, all things that will be, propelled forward in the US by the Biden agenda, are going to transform these sectors, which represents, both a threat to, Canada's export competitiveness, but also an opportunity if we can appropriately pivot. At RBC, we looked at, what could be an alternative, path for Canada's exports. And we found that even if, Canada recovered a portion of parity between export growth and economic growth, it could represent another $1 trillion in exports over the next 10 years, which, could be an important driver of growth and post-pandemic recovery.
Absolutely worthwhile making that point. So obviously the government of Canada just released its federal budget a week ago from this recording. It was approved since then already. How does that budget support or challenge, or in any kind of way relate, I suppose, to the findings and recommendation of RBC's report?
We found that generally there are quite a few budget announcements that aligned with the issues we identify in the report, and indeed, aligned with some of the general recommendations. So you saw in the budget targeted measures to support select growth industries, measures to support supply chain competitiveness and Canada's trade positioning. So you just, for some examples, you saw money to promote clean technology products, funding for research and development into critical minerals, infrastructure spending on, specific trade infrastructure, and also, for example, a strategic investment fund, public money that is to be matched with private money and promote targeted investments in areas of future growth. So, these and other, actions of the government, including the communique in the post-Trudeau Biden summit, showed that the government recognized these issues. What we're calling for in the report, I think, is to go, a step further to articulate a strategy for how Canada positions itself holistically and to take stock of the policies we have that are separately supporting competitiveness, innovation, trade, industry, and to view these holistically to all be pushing in the same direction. And so we think that, there could be more work in that direction, but also, it's not the government's not the only actor here. The government can set the conditions and the infrastructure, but it's also up to, businesses and public institutions, research institutions to pivot and to take advantage of these opportunities.
A marquee piece of the Biden administration's plan is called Build Back Better. How can Canada position itself to benefit from it, considering what you said earlier as well about sort of risks and rewards?
Absolutely. So Biden looks to accelerate these kind of global forces in a big way, supporting green and technology and, reshoring. He's seeking to establish the U.S. at the center of new and growing digital and green supply chains. And in doing so, pivot from reliance on China in these strategic areas and, provide a geopolitical counterweight. Right now, Biden has an infrastructure package that is, a $2.3 trillion infrastructure package being discussed that, includes some of these foundations. And, a lot of them are climate policy that ultimately support both his economic and trade policy. So in this, you see, the traditional package of climate incentives that are really going to promote domestic green technology adoption, the retooling or establishing of U.S. manufacturing, and significant funding for research and development to, make the U.S. a research powerhouse and technology powerhouse in these new and growing areas. And that, not only does it green the U.S. economy, but it attracts, high-paying manufacturing jobs. And it also, in the words of the Biden campaign, allows the U.S. to win the competition for the future against China. So, where does Canada fit in all this? Well, there are specific areas that we highlight in the report where Canada can probably, leverage and benefit particularly. But in a very general sense, a successful U.S. growth strategy is going to be beneficial for Canada, given how our economies are intertwined. But we also see from our neighbors down south a strong, America First agenda. And so the question for Canada is how we take our leverage and our opportunities to extract the most out of this opportunity. And it means we have to leverage what we have, enhanced market access to the U.S., integrated companies like our auto companies, specific leverage in certain, areas like critical minerals, where the Biden administration is looking to secure, a consistent supply from an ethical supplier or trusted supplier. And we need to use this leverage to convince the Biden administration that we're a strategic partner in these areas and a trusted partner, and ultimately to encourage Biden to reframe the America First agenda as a North America First approach.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting one to see unfold. Now, the report also puts forward 5 key considerations. What are they, and who, in terms of key stakeholders, must do what now to drive each forward?
To roll up a little bit, our hallmark recommendation is ultimately that, the right people need to get together to take a comprehensive look at our policy framework that supports trade, that supports competitiveness, that supports industry. So these are, the public sector, the private sector, academia, labor, kind of the whole gamut, because in many areas, Canada already has industrial policies that are supporting some of these areas. There's been, announcements, the Superclusters Initiative, other green technology initiatives, and certainly, more from this budget. So we're already kind of pursuing these directions in terms of industries that are supporting these green and digital growing areas of the economy. For us, it's, we probably should probe a little bit more about whether these policies are coherent, whether they also support our trade objectives, and to reevaluate them ultimately in light of these shifting circumstances and this big Biden opportunity. That's our hallmark recommendation. From that, there's a couple, other, you might group them, recommendations. One is to find partnerships within North America, with the US and Mexico, as ways to strategically further our interests, whether it be for critical mineral development with the US or other areas of strategic cooperation that we could, ultimately become a trusted partner and meet our own, reshoring and domestic needs. And the second one is, in a lot of ways, turning toward or embracing a Biden vision or North America approach. While it certainly has a lot of prospective benefits, in its own way, it's also backtracking from our, another plank of our trade strategy for years, which has been strategic diversification away from the US market. We certainly can't ignore the Biden opportunity, but at the same time, it makes sense to continue to diversify, to open and deepen more markets so that we still have markets or larger markets for the goods that we produce in these new areas or existing areas.
Which Canadian industries stand to benefit the most from the opportunities the report identifies, and what do we have to do to secure those opportunities?
Many Canadian industries have opportunities in trade globally, from agriculture to ocean tech, to the services that could benefit from the increasing digitization of the economy. In the report, we focused on, particular areas stemming from the Biden agenda. And so to those three major, export components in our U.S. export basket: energy, metals and minerals, and autos, we, identified opportunities or areas that they could pivot to. So clean technologies broadly, electric vehicles and batteries, and critical minerals.
Sort of as a, getting towards a wrap up, the report also calls for a comprehensive strategy for the future of Canadian trade. And that's really our bread and butter at TheFutureEconomy.ca. So we'd love to know what, in RBC's perspective, that the strategy's main pillars would be.
First of all, it needs to recognize the context that there are these global forces and be more specific about how they're, challenging or threatening or reshaping some of our, traditional industries. Secondly, we need to take stock realistically of where Canada has strengths in these areas, where are our best opportunities for export competitiveness, where are also opportunities for meeting our own domestic goals, and, anything that supports both the domestic imperatives such as, greening or decarbonizing our own economy, but can also be used to, fuel export-led growth is a good opportunity. We need to, focus on something that we've always said we need to focus on, which is general competitiveness, innovation, improving our commercialization of our products, tax competitiveness, all these, the whole suite of policies, how they support skilled labor, immigration, all these things, how can they be in line to support, these types of imperatives. And finally, something that, I think we're all increasingly hearing more of, and it's worth talking about, is we need to rethink industrial policy. Industrial policy, kind of can be a bit of a controversial topic because it has, histories of both successes and failures. But, like most other economies, Canada is engaging in industrial policy. It has for a while, and we're doing it more, partly as a function of our climate policies. Carbon taxes in some areas are not possible or only go so far. And we have, like other countries, policies or will need to pursue policies that support more direct decarbonization efforts. And so the question is, are we using those tools in a deliberate way and to support these objectives? And a final component of this type of strategy is who outlines a strategy. And so it's something that obviously a federal government will play a big role in, and government in general, but it also needs to take into account the private sector, the businesses on the ground, academia and our research institutions and labor organizations to fully take stock of Canada's position and how we can best leverage it going forward.
I love that last point. We recently interviewed Monique Leroux, who is the founding, I suppose, chair of the Industry Strategy Council. And so hopefully that kind of council, as well as our economic strategy tables, serve that imperative. Now, this might have been your pitch already, but I'm still going to ask you, or at least give you an opportunity for a sort of a final 30 seconds pitch, to anyone in a position of power that you think can ultimately strengthen, improve, Canada's global trade position. So first, who would you pitch? And then in 30 seconds, what would you say?
Well, I think it would be no surprise given my prior comments, but I would, look to the federal government to convene the right people in the public sector, private sector, academia, labor, the whole gamut of appropriate people to articulate a strategy for how Canada can compete in this new trade landscape so we can advantageously position Canada in the decisions that are being made now globally that will shape opportunities in trade for the decades to come.